So yeah, thanks very much, Simon, for that lovely introduction, and for everybody for coming. It's funny, last week I spoke at a Young Fabians event, and on Monday I was speaking at an Adam Smith Institute event, and today I'm at a Libertarian Home event, so clearly getting more and more radicalised as the days go on. If I'm not in a gun-toting compound in Minnesota or in Montana by the end of next week, I've done something wrong. But thank you very much, everybody, and I'm really glad to finally have been able to come here, and hope to see you many times again, as well as an audience member. So the minimum wage debate is an interesting one, because as Simon mentioned, I am a pure consequentialist, and like many people, I think the welfare of the poor is what is really the most important pressing matter in the world today. And for many people who maybe think it's obvious that if you care about the poor, you should just raise the minimum wage, it's kind of difficult to communicate that actually there's a very, very strong case in the opposite direction. If you care about the poor, you should not want to raise the minimum wage. In fact, you should probably want to abolish it. So it's something that I'm interested in as a libertarian, and as somebody who's interested in economics, and as somebody who is interested in, I hope, improving the welfare of the poor by arguing and writing and so on for better, freer world policies. So I thought that was my phone. I'd suddenly set up some sort of crazy thing. So it is a kind of an interesting one, though, because in terms of the theory, which most people probably know, it should be pretty obvious. Supply and demand are concepts I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, and if you put a price floor on something, and the price floor happens to be above the market clearing price for that good, then you're left with a surplus of that good. And when we talk about labour, the surplus is also known as unemployment. You have too many people with basically not able to set the price of their labour at a rate that basically is profitable to employ them at. And the theory is so clear, and it's kind of Econ 101, and it's not the kind, but it's Econ 101, but it's so clear that it's very, very surprising that there's any debate about this at all. And actually, it's very surprising that the empirical evidence is so conflicted on this. And I think that as a Hayekian, and we were talking about this earlier, it's kind of a reminder that the world is so complex, and I'll come back to this at the end, but the world is so complex that even things that seem completely obvious to us, putting a price floor on labour should lead to unemployment, doesn't always seem to lead to this. I think it's something worth bearing in mind, and it makes me more humble because I used to be a very, very kind of theoretical type guy. I used to kind of say, look, it's obvious, put a price floor on this, you're going to get unemployment and so on. And now I hope I've become a little bit more humble and so on, and that's why I'm so interested in the empirical debate around it. Because really we're actually living through the debate. Up until the 1990s, there was a virtual consensus among economists that minimum wage led to unemployment. They used basically time series data, so they looked at periods in the past where there had been, they did quite a crude kind of approach and used quite crude regressions and they found what you would expect, that minimum wage increases led to increases in unemployment. And from about 1992 onwards, that started to change. So the two big names on the kind of pro-minimum wage side are Card and Kruger. And many of you will be familiar with their kind of seminal article, which looked at fast food restaurants in New Jersey and looked at the employment effects of minimum wage increases in those fast food restaurants. And surprisingly, they found that there was no relationship between an increase in the minimum wage and an increase in unemployment in those places. And it was quite an interesting kind of micro-level study, because they phoned up manually just all the fast food restaurants and asked them, how many hours are you giving out this week, or how many hours are you giving out this month, and so on. And this and some other work that they did led to a kind of seismic shock, and still when you get onto an argument on the internet today, this is the paper that you can expect to be referred back to, and it's worth reading and it's worth being aware of, but this is the kind of cornerstone of the sort of pro-minimum wage economic argument. But they didn't really have a theoretical basis for why would this be the case, why wouldn't we experience this disemployment effect, and it's taken a while, but I think the most interesting I think probably the best defense of this is Doob. And I had a shocking moment the other day when I was talking to David Scarbeck, who's an economist at KCL, and he was telling me that this Doob, and I'm maybe mispronouncing his name, I'm sorry if you're watching, Doob, for mispronouncing your name, but when David Scarbeck told me that he was actually a she, and I had a kind of brief panic that I've been reading all this person's work and thinking, oh, this guy, you know, blah, 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 and kind of misgendering them and so on, but it turns out actually there are two Doob economists, and I think it's Ajahn Jabbat Doob, who is an Indian guy who works on this, and so he uses very kind of interesting econometric techniques to try and control for the sort of problems that you would expect to encounter in any kind of empirical approach to economics. So I'll just talk about a couple of them because they're kind of important to this debate. So time series. You know, through looking through the past, that there have been periods where we have been rich and there are periods where we've been less rich. So econometrics or econometricians try to control for that by kind of randomizing some of the factors to do with time and so on. There are things like fixed location factors. So Robert Murphy, who's a free market economist, uses the example that it's hot in Florida and it's cold in Minnesota. So that might have an impact on employment. And that might mean that, for example, people are less inclined to move away from Florida if the minimum wage increases and more inclined to move away from Minnesota. So you want to control for things like that. There are location time trends. So, for example, the car manufacturing industry in Detroit is on a slow decline, and you want to control for example, a factory shutting down. That if the minimum wage was increased the day that, on a completely unrelated note, General Motors shut down a huge factory, you'd want to be able to separate out those two factors from each other, because it wouldn't be a fair judgment of the impact of the minimum wage increase. So Doob uses a really interesting approach, which is he looks at counties that border each other in different states. So he kind of tries to control for the other things, but he also figures that, I think fairly, that in US states in America, the counties that border each other on the borders are probably the best kind of controls that we can have. So he tries to kind of look at look at the difference between states where they raise up the minimum wage and a neighbouring state, county, where they have not raised the minimum wage. And he concedes that if you don't control for things like this, then yes, there is a very clear relationship between increasing the minimum wage and increases in unemployment. However, he contends, and it is true in his work, that if you use control groups like this in the kind of bordering state counties, that you no longer see this relationship, and the relationship seems to deteriorate and break down, and he arrives at no impact. So this is something that I think we really have to consider, because the world is very, very complex, and if we're making this case that minimum wage is a bad thing, we need to be aware of the fact that it could be that the arguments that we make are kind of overwhelmed by other factors that we're not aware of. You know, we're basically very, very ignorant people. Everybody is. But it's worth thinking about what might kind of override, what might be the other factors. And I think one argument and one kind of rejoinder that I've heard to the sort of Doob type arguments is, so what Doob doesn't look at, and what the people who say that there is no employment effect don't look at, is the labour force participation rate. So Robert Murphy argues that what's actually happening when you raise the minimum wage is you're attracting people who would either be early retirees or kind of or in that kind of area, or they might be kind of stay-at-home husbands or wives who would otherwise not be in the workforce at all, and they're the ones who are getting these jobs. And in fact, you're still seeing a displacement of the marginal workers, the people who have very, very low productivity and who would be very, very difficult to employ at a profitable rate if the minimum wage was raised. They're still being pushed out of the workforce, so they're still being pushed out of jobs. It's just that they're being replaced by people who wouldn't be looking for jobs at all. And so that's why when you look at the economic data in this way, you don't get the kind of unemployment effect that we'd expect to see. So I'm interested in this kind of phenomenon because I'm constantly wondering, you know, especially because one of the things I do in my job, and one of the things you do in a job in a think tank, is comment on policy. And you don't want to just go out there and be an ass and say that this is going to be terrible, this is going to destroy people's lives, if you have no good reason to think that, and if there's a lot of evidence saying that you're wrong. So I've started looking at the overall literature, and there are about 103 kind of good studies, and maybe a couple more, the 103 in the US. And these have been compiled into a really, really important literature review by Newmark and Voscher, who are the kind of anti-Carden-Kruger. And they looked at all of these 103 studies and found that of the 103 studies, including I think Dude's study as well, but all of the pro and anti, about 66%, about 2/3 do find that there is an unemployment effect. So even though we have some standout studies like Dube, like Carden-Kruger, overall it seems as if the majority is still finding this kind of unemployment effect that you would expect to see. Interestingly, if you look at only the 33 most kind of methodologically robust studies in this in the kind of canon of minimum wage studies, 85% of those show an unemployment effect. So there does actually seem, even though you have kind of headline standout studies, the kind of consensus, and I'm using the word carefully because I think we have to be careful about using scientific consensus or academic consensus as a rhetorical tool. Having said that, if we're trying to if we're not knowledgeable about a subject, and if we're trying to find out what it is that people who've gone out and looked at the world are saying, and we find that we have this 85% or 66% showing that minimum wage does create unemployment, I think that's a very, very important thing to remember. And it's something that the people who argue that, yeah, well, here's a study that shows that there isn't one, haven't really reckoned with. Because the world is so complex, you might get certain studies where there is no unemployment effect. Maybe it's because of this labour force participation rate that we're not familiar with, or that might exist, but I'm not sure. But I don't know. More intriguingly, and kind of I think more sort of intuitively appealing, because it sort of sidesteps the whole debate, is a new working paper by Meir and West. And their argument is that don't look at levels of employment. Don't expect for the McDonald's manager, for example, to sack 10% of his workforce if the minimum wage goes up by however much, 20% or something like that. What you should be looking at is the growth rate in employment, because sacking workers reduces morale overall. So sacking workers has its own costs associated with it. However, they claim, and I think that this has been challenged, so I think we have to be careful, as always, with any empirical work, but they claim that actually what happens is when you raise the minimum wage, the increase in job creation slows down. People are slower and more reluctant to take on new employees. They possibly switch to automation, to self-service checkouts and things like that at Tesco, but their argument is really, and if this is right, then it means that the whole debate is wrong, and that both sides in this debate have been looking at the wrong thing, and in large part they've been kind of wasting their time. But the kind of fundamental argument that I think is important with the minimum wage is that, yes, I think probably the majority of the consensus is with us in being people who think raising the minimum wage is a bad idea, or even having a minimum wage is a bad idea. Yes, I think there is this argument that the economic growth or the job creation or labour hours improvement is slowing down. But there's also quite a lot of evidence that, and this goes back to the Robert Murphy argument, that there are people, the people who are displaced, even if it draws in other workers, the people who are displaced are the most marginal people in society, and they're the people who are me at 16 years old with, not fantastic school grades and things like that, getting really important work experience at McDonald's. I'm not exactly the most marginal, or I didn't come from the most marginal family in society, but there are people who are and really rely on these kind of things, and there are quite a few papers which show a long-term decrease in people's earnings when the minimum wage is increased. And we have the historical data for this now, to be able to see that increases in the minimum wage in the 1980s have led to people, the poorest people, not being able to acquire the skills that they need to earn this much money, say, over the course of their life. So it's cost them significantly in the long term because they've had this difficulty in finding a new job. So it's actually interesting because some people who are in favour of the minimum wage know this. And one of the things that's kind of interesting historically is in South Africa, one of the main arguments for the introduction of kind of certain industry-specific minimum wages was from whites to exclude black workers. So they basically said we can't compete with these guys, and they're basically undercutting us. So you need to put a price floor in, and that way most of these railways, because they're also run by whites, would prefer to hire us. So this is a good thing for us. We see this at the moment in California. There's a guy named Ron Unz who used to be a proprietor of the American Conservative. He's a very interesting guy. He's very, very unfortunately anti-immigration, very anti-Hispanic immigration. And he's campaigning for a huge increase in the minimum wage in California. And it's explicitly because he wants to exclude Hispanic workers from the workforce. He wants to stop Mexicans from being able to get jobs in California. And it's actually kind of a genius way of sidestepping the immigration debate, because you get suddenly all these left-wing guys who are really right on and really want to help the poor and so on, so we just raise the minimum wage and so on. And actually, unbelievably, you see exactly the same argument coming from Polly Toynbee, who wrote a couple of months ago in The Guardian, well, immigration, I'm a good bleeding heart liberal and I'm in favour of immigration, so I was like, great, fantastic, I'm very excited by this, but I'm very worried as well about English people and so on. So let's have a very, very high minimum wage to stop immigrants from being able to get jobs.
She's not a liberal, but she should burn in hell.
That's too kind.
I don't endorse that statement, but there is but it's interesting because you kind of have this almost unholy alliance between people who recognize that the minimum wage is harmful, in a way anyway. They might not recognize that it's harmful to native workers, they might not have thought it through completely, but they certainly see the logic that putting price floors on labour does seem empirically and theoretically to exclude people from the workforce. And they use this as a way of keeping out the groups that they don't want to get into work. And it's funny, kind of horrible, but that there are people now on the left who probably consider themselves to be very kind of right-on people who are going along with this. But there's another argument that I think is really interesting as well. The Keynesian, and actually I think there's a lot of merit to this, explanation for recessions is sticky wages, that basically workers don't adjust their, for various reasons, don't adjust their wage demands downward when there's less money, nominal money going around in the economy, so you get involuntary unemployment. Milton Friedman, this is basically a monetarist, Keynesian, new classical economics argument. I think there's a lot of merit to it, but interestingly and weirdly, you get exactly the same people saying that raising the price of labour at this point doesn't create any unemployment. But which is it? Because either sticky wages displace, either firms do not have the ability to hire, or to just kind of come up with the money they need to hire people, and so on, which would lead you to the sticky wages thesis, but would also lead you to think that a minimum wage creates unemployment, or it doesn't. And so you do, I think, get a real inconsistency from people who advocate this sort of Keynesian style. And it's not just a Keynesian point, but Keynesians do tend to believe this. So it's a strange thing where you get this kind of inconsistency from people. So kind of fundamentally, my argument about the minimum wage is that the theory is very clear, and I think there's no disputing the theory. And actually, interestingly, when people say, "Oh, that's Econ 101," it's not as if in Econ 102 or anything like that they tell you, "Oh, by the way, everything we taught you in Econ 101 is wrong." It's I saw a great tweet the other day, which is sort of academic or postgraduate level economics is all about telling you why Econ 101 doesn't apply when it's politically convenient for it to not apply. And there's probably some truth to that, but it's not like they tell you secretly later on that supply and demand doesn't exist or it doesn't actually happen. So the Econ 101 argument doesn't really apply. However, I do think that the world is so complex that we have to accept the complexity of the world, that we can't make a simple, if you do this, you'll create unemployment, because it makes us look silly, and it's not an intellectually sophisticated or mature argument to make. I think we have to accept that we might be wrong, there might be something we're not seeing. However, I think the empirical evidence is on our side. I think if you look at the bulk of the studies that have been done, and you look at the various different theories and so on, and hypotheses that have been put forward, what you get to is to a point where anybody who is worried about the precautionary principle, anybody who is actually concerned about the welfare of the poor, has to, I think, honestly look at the evidence and say it's too much of a risk. Yes, it's possible. Yes, there are some papers that say that that there isn't this effect, but they're in the minority, and there's a lot of evidence on the other side as well. If you really want to help the poor, then you're taking an extremely, at best, extremely risky approach to do it. So that's one of the reasons that I encourage other libertarians to do this. And here's the red meat for I'm used to just saying things to wind up other libertarians. I happen to believe them usually, but think that advocacy of a negative income tax is very important as well. because I think that proposing a very simple, because I think that the fear among people who believe in the minimum wage is that you're basically going to leave people on £2 an hour dying on the streets. And whether or not that's true, I think that it's a very, very powerful emotive argument, and I think that it's something that we have to reckon with. And if we don't want to just have it as people who talk and think about libertarianism every day of their lives, if we want to make the argument in the public to people, I think that it's important to give them a reason why this wouldn't happen, and to kind of give them an economically sound reason why this wouldn't happen. But I'm interested in talking about that later. But to sum up, really, and sorry if I've gone over the time, or I'm not sure, but to sum up, there's quite a lot of evidence, and really there is nothing like the evidence that we would like to be totally sure that raising the minimum wage always creates unemployment. And I'm really, really against using apocalyptic language and using apocalyptic kind of arguments when we talk about the minimum wage, because they often don't turn out to be true, and it makes us look silly and it undermines our arguments overall. What I do think is that if you care about the welfare of the poor, then you cannot take the risk of doing this, because there are much better ways of helping them, and this is one that puts somebody else's life in danger and not your own. So, thank you very much.